You're listening to the podcast Women Ending War. I'm your co-host, Ilana Stockman, a Jewish Israeli-American, along with my co-hosts Eva Dalak and Dr. Faher Halun, Palestinian citizens of Israel. Together, we are activating peace. Welcome. I'm here with Dr. Dahlia Scheindlin, a noted public opinion researcher in Israel for the past 25 years, political analyst, frequent commentator on Israeli political trends and public opinion, and the author most recently of The Crooked Timber of Democracy in Israel, Promise Unfulfilled, as well as a columnist in Haaretz. Welcome, Dahlia.
Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, thank you for being here on the podcast called Women Ending War, and I'm so happy to have you in that category and to follow all your really important work and all the places that I've seen you and heard you speak. And you're very informative, very authoritative, and very inspiring. So thank you for all the work that you do.
Thank you so much.
Yeah. So let's talk a little bit about Israeli public opinion, especially about this war, this second year now of this war and this government. What can you tell us about where we are today in this chaos that we're in? Has public opinion shifted recently? Have you seen changes recently?
Most important shifts have been long and slow, and they're not very dramatic. And when we talk about the Israeli public, we have to note that there are very significant subdivisions within the Israeli public. It's very hard to generalize because the public is so divided.
Yeah.
And the first and deepest division is between Jewish and Palestinian citizens of Israel, and they have almost completely opposite views of the war. For example, of course, it shouldn't be totally surprising that the Palestinian respondents or Arab citizens who respond to surveys are, the vast majority of them support a ceasefire and have supported a ceasefire from the very beginning. And think the war is not, the level of damage the war is doing is not justified, et cetera. And anything with relation to the war, they are much less supportive and they're much more supportive of ending the war. When it comes to Israel's Jewish citizens, which are the majority, and certainly among, the adult population, they're about 73%, but oftentimes 80% of the actual surveys that we look at. And the Israeli public, depending on how you test these kinds of things, has tended to be much more supportive of the war, much more accepting of the levels of destruction in Gaza. They think that it's justified, given what Israel is taking with, not just because they enjoy it. And the vast majority of Israelis and Israeli Jews and Palestinians alike believe that the ongoing conflict is damaging to Israelis. That's a regular question being asked, for example, in the Peace Index survey by my colleagues at Tel Aviv University. So first of all, you have very, very opposing views in terms of Israeli Jews' acceptance and even support for the war. However, I will say that there are significant doubts about the war in the sense that even Israeli Jews are concerned about what are the final war aims. And there has been concern, and over time we've seen growing concern among the Jewish public, which was, much more confident in the ability to win the war in the first number of months, and in the sense that the government has clear aims. But we've seen a growing portion of Israelis and Israeli Jews who do not see that the government has clear aims or definitely has clear aims in the war. And that, I think, has risen alongside a growing, critical discourse about that and discussions in mainstream Israeli society, that the government has refused to kind of put out, its final aims for the war, other than these very broad slogans almost of total victory, which people understand they can't really define and doesn't really give an endpoint to it. The other thing I should say that unifies the majority of Jewish and Palestinian citizens of Israel, even though we're talking about different numbers. But the majority of both of those populations, or one might say the entire Israeli public, shows the majority who would prefer that the highest priority be hostage release. That is something that unifies the Israeli public. Of course, there is a portion of Israeli society that does not think that should be the top goal at the expense of other goals, but they are a minority, and they pretty much have been a minority no matter how the question is asked. Now, it's hard to give exact numbers because this question is asked in different ways by different survey companies or researchers over time. But I can say that for the most part, the portion of people who prefer a hostage release deal to be prioritized or to be the government's choice as opposed to some other contradictory goal such as continuing the war, because hostage release deal includes a ceasefire, is generally an absolute majority of Israelis and even an absolute majority of both Jewish and Palestinian citizens of Israel. Um, and for example, in the most recent Peace Index survey, I'm referring to that one quite a bit because that just came out a few days ago. We see that to give you an example of the breakdown. 2/3 of the Jewish sample would prefer the hostage release by any means over the elimination of Hamas. That's how the question was asked in that case. And that's a very strong, response by any measure. Among
Right.
the Arab respondents in that survey, we had 3/4 who gave that answer. So it is something that where we, unlike some of the other responses with relation to the war, on the issue of the hostages, we do see much more similar trends among both the absolute majority of both Jewish and Arab or Palestinian citizens of Israel.
And that was very specific. It was very specific against the opposing view, which is like, oh yeah, we have to destroy
Hamas by any means necessary. Exactly.
Yeah.
But that's a pattern that tends to repeat itself. I would say the lowest I've ever seen in support for a hostage release deal is below 50%, but in the upper 40% range. And even that shows a 10-point lead over whatever the other option was that was being proposed. In other words, you always have more Israelis who prefer a hostage release deal to the alternative.
And yet, this government, in its decision making and its prioritizing, is not reflecting that. This government is systematically ignoring that public reality. And not only that, but I hear a lot from Jews around the world who don't understand that, who think that whatever the Netanyahu government is doing, well, he was elected, in a democracy by a majority, so therefore Israelis must agree with him. And I find myself having these conversations where I'm trying to explain that no, Bibi is not reflecting Israeli public opinion. Is that right?
He's definitely not reflecting public opinion on this issue. And I think that what the government has tried to do is create a very kind of a reasoning or an explanation. Some might even call it a narrative in the popular terminology that is very counterintuitive, and it simply cuts across reality. And that idea that he has been trying to advance throughout this time is that the military campaign is the best way to bring the hostages back, that only military pressure will bring the hostages back. And he says this again and again, and his party figures say it again and again, his ministers say it again and again, his coalition leaders say it again and again. And they've been saying it for 14 months now. And the fact is that the only thing that ever helped get hostages back was a temporary ceasefire and a deal that involved the release of just over 100 hostages back in November, over a year ago. And so when Israelis see that week after week or month after month, hostages are dying, either they're being killed by Hamas or they're being killed in circumstances we don't know, possibly by Israeli bombardments. Some were really one of the most horrible tragedies of this entire war was when 3 hostages were shot by Israeli forces, or they were deliberately killed by Hamas, knowing that Israeli forces were approaching. I mean, when people find this out, it's very hard to convince them that somehow the military campaign is good for releasing the hostages, because it simply cuts across the reality that Israelis see day to day. And so, the government can be elected, and it certainly isn't going to have sweeping majority. That doesn't mean it has sweeping majority support on everything it does. That's a normal situation for democracies. But what's not normal in a democracy is to argue that an election is a blank check to do anything. And frankly, what this government has done since it was elected has been going against the grain of public opinion and the majority of public opinion pretty much since its establishment and long before the war. So we saw the best example, which is now becoming relevant again. Well, it has been relevant this whole time, but it's becoming freshly relevant just this week, was the attempt to undermine the independence of the Israeli judiciary and undercut Israel's rule of law institutions, particularly the courts and the Supreme Court and the Judicial Appointment Committee, through the Justice Minister, Netanyahu's Justice Minister from Likud. His name is Yariv Levin. And since Yariv Levin announced that package, which was really within about 5 or 6 days after the government was established in early 2023, the majority of Israelis in every survey, right, have been against the reform package. And hundreds of thousands of people have gone out went out onto the streets. And so this government has been going against public opinion on very critical issues even before the war. And certainly since the war, even if the judicial reform was somewhat more controversial, again, pretty much a majority in almost no matter how it was tested, was against the package the way it was presented and the way the government was trying to pass it. But when it comes to the hostages, by contrast, you have a much more stable majority who are for hostage release during the course of this war. And the government, it seems, has practiced and become accustomed over the months and nearly 2 years since it was established now to ignoring the majority of public opinion on absolutely existential life and death issues when it comes to the future of the country and the future of its citizens.
Yeah. How do you interpret that? I know there are a lot of different views about why that is, but what is your interpretation?
I think that the obvious interpretation is that the prime minister wants to keep his government together, doesn't want his government to collapse, and uh, we're always trying to divine what he thinks inside his head, but certainly his coalition partners are very, very open that they do not want to end the war, that they are against a ceasefire. Several of the more extreme far right ultra nationalist, religious fundamentalists in his government openly say that they want to annex Gaza, build settlements there. They have held rallies and conferences and speeches, and they're not making any secret of it. Now, there's a debate about whether Netanyahu himself is ideologically committed to continuing the war so that this program of annexation and eventual resettlement of Gaza by Jewish Israelis can go on. At this point, it doesn't matter. He is essentially prioritizing that attitude within his government that the war must go on no matter what the cost. In terms of human lives, both lives in Gaza, which has now by the tallies of the Gaza Ministry of Health is now over 45,000 people, which doesn't break down fighters or militants and civilians. But we know that huge and, frankly, devastating number of Palestinian civilians have been killed in that, women and children within that bigger number. And of course, Israelis who are being killed as well, soldiers who are dying in battle, hostages who are dying, and the government essentially is saying we are either going to give in to the demands of the extremists and the government, or Netanyahu is essentially aligned with them himself ideologically. That's another possibility. We know that one of his longest term commitments as an ideological commitment has been to prevent the establishment of a Palestinian state. He has not made that any secret. For most of his career, he said that openly. The only time he ever agreed to anything even remotely like a Palestinian state under very, very strictly constrained terms was really rather a short window of a few years when he came back into office from 2009 for a few years. But even then, he wasn't really creating the conditions for it to happen. And for most of his life, it's been a significant commitment of his to prevent a Palestinian state alongside his other major ideological commitment, which is to rally the world against Iran's influence in the region, especially its nuclear ambitions. It's possible that he is simply ideologically, essentially, sufficiently aligned with those far right parties in his government. It's possible that he simply doesn't want the government to fall to keep himself in power, connected to his trials, which is a bit of. I always look for the evidence in these situations because I'm not inside his head as an analyst. And for that, to my mind, it exists, but it may not be as strong. And the reason I say that is because his trials are ongoing, even while he's in government. Being in government hasn't stopped his trials, and it's not going to stop the justices from reaching a verdict of one sort or another. I have been attending the trials. I was there last week to hear Netanyahu's testimony, and I will be again this week, and the entire country is sort of watching, even though people are consumed by the status of the war. So one possibility is that another possibility is that he wants the government to stay in power to somehow mitigate the outcome of his trials, but that's a little bit murkier because he probably can't stop the trials. However, the outcome of staying in government and the benefit for him, given his ongoing trials, it has to do with some hypotheticals. The government, of course, has been trying to re-engineer the Judicial Appointment Committee, and there's an understanding that if it does do that, it will be able to possibly appoint judges who are being appointed not for their professionalism, but for their likelihood of maybe being more lenient on Netanyahu if an appeal against his verdict, for example, should reach the Supreme Court, which is not impossible, right? The trials being held in a district court, whatever the verdict is, if it doesn't look good, it can be appealed, then it might go to the Supreme Court, in which case Netanyahu will be happy to have friendly judges in the Supreme Court. The longer he stays in power, the more likelihood there is of replacing the Attorney General. This is something that's been very front and center now to the messages coming out of the government, individual government figures who've been calling day in, day out to fire the attorney general, claiming that she doesn't support government policy, which is also actually factually untrue. She approves most of the government policy. In the few places where she sets limits and says that they are violating the law is when she considers that they are violating the law. But they are possibly hoping that if they are able to install a more friendly attorney general, that the attorney general can, decide not to continue prosecuting some of those cases and so on. So it's not clear that those are actual, plans or strategies yet. But Netanyahu certainly has an interest in staying in office and therefore going along with the preferences of his coalition partners with relation to the war. The reason for why Netanyahu is continuing this war against public opinion, and we should note this, is what he's saying. And what he's saying, like I said in the beginning, you can believe it or not believe it. Most Israelis don't believe it, but that the idea that significant military pressure, that harsh military pressure is the way to get the hostages back and to destroy Hamas completely. The very, very, I would say, routine, almost everyday criticism from pretty much every level of society, including the top military establishment, is that the ongoing military campaign has essentially used itself up. You have even senior military figures saying that there are no more real targets to hit in Gaza, that Hamas has been incapacitated militarily, and that it's still a governing force only because the government has not articulated any plan for an alternative governing force or established any plan for alternative governing force, at least
also,
not
by the way, the
really.
military pressure does not get the hostages back. It has done nothing.
As I said, yeah.
Yeah.
Well, not just nothing, but the hostages are dying over time. I mean, the number of hostages that are confirmed dead simply keeps going up.
Yeah.
Many of them have died, during various hostage negotiations.
And also, just getting back to what you were saying before about the Netanyahu government and the sort of the threats to democracy and the judicial system and to the attorney general. I mean, when you're talking, sometimes I don't know if I'm hearing a description of Israel or America. Are we talking about Bibi or are we talking about Trump? Because some of these dynamics sound almost identical. Is that right? Is that a fair assessment?
Well, I think we can look at democratic erosion in numerous countries. I mean, America and Israel are certainly not the only countries that have been where populist illiberal leaders have exploited the electoral system. The electoral democracy aspect of democracy, which is a very part of democracy. It's a piece. It's a limited piece, and it's not enough on its own. But they've exploited, popular vote in order to install, to run winning campaigns for people whose ultimate aim is to dismantle the very systems that allow elections to be free and fair. So when I say illiberal, what I mean is that there are a number of countries, and Hungary comes to mind, of course. That's the sort of gold standard to look at when it comes to a country that might have been on its way towards establishing a more robust democracy, but under Viktor Orban has become increasingly illiberal, with so much of the judiciary and media, et cetera, essentially co-opted or captured by the executive power. And we've seen it, and we've seen the rise of similar parties and leaders in other countries as well. Poland was going in that direction until they recently. There are similar kinds of leaders in places like Serbia, and we can see the pattern. And so the pattern is that using the popular election and I think, exploiting people's sometimes legitimate sense of having been left out of the democratic system, the economic disparities in some of these different countries, exploiting class and racial divides. And in Israel's case, the long-running sense of an existential threat due to an ethno-nationalist conflict, a military conflict, which always creates a different situation than you would have in a peaceful democracy. But all of those can be leveraged. And of course, in Europe, it's the immigration factor. You can always, and in the US too, you can always leverage those to claim that there's an existential threat to either physical safety or identity. And the people who have already felt marginalized and left out sometimes support the leader who claims that he's going to protect that, or she, right? We also have Giorgia Meloni making similar arguments in Italy. And that leader then comes into power and begins to dismantle individual, it can be human rights, civil liberties, but particularly civil liberties and the institutions that are the critical checks and balances on the power of the government that allow us to have free thought, free choice, and ultimately the freedom to make our arguments and make elections meaningful. And I think that's what we're seeing in a number of countries. It's not only the US, but let's just say these leaders, these processes, they certainly feed off each other. They inspire one another. They give each other similar tactics. Some of the tactics we've seen in Israel we see them in places like Russia and China. It's not only these middle of the road democratic erosion
Like what?
situations. Now, I remind you,
Can you give an example? Can you give an example of how?
here's a very, very technical example. And it sounds technical and small, but I would urge people not to dismiss the small technical changes, and I'll explain why afterwards. One of the many changes that this current Knesset, which is on what people are calling a legislative blitz, I mean, it's really an avalanche, a blinding pace of legislation that will, squeeze the freedoms in media and civil society, and the rights of Arab citizens in Israel. One of the things they've been trying to pass is something called the ratings law. It sounds so esoteric, but the idea would be to force television stations to display their rating, what their share is of the view audience on the screen. Except that there's one catch. The government also wants to re-engineer the system and the people and the committee for who determine rating, so that it can basically show that a far right-wing pro-government television outlet has the highest rating. That's basically what they're trying to do. Now, when there was a media expert analyzing this bill, is a researcher on these issues at the Israel Democracy Institute, and they asked her what else we'd seen something like a government engineered body or method for determining the ratings. And she said, well, it's basically the kind of thing you would see in China. And so,
or in a George Orwell novel. I mean, this is George Orwell, isn't it? I mean, it's like where the state is telling you what you like. The state is telling you that what you're watching is the thing that you like the most, like engineering how you feel about what the state is saying to you. That's what it.
Sure. I mean, the only thing I would say is that if you want to talking about the critical topic of George Orwell, which is essential for any listener and every human being, I would say that we don't necessarily need George Orwell's novels to see this kind of thing in practice. It's happening all the time. What I do think is that people should be reading George Orwell's essays, where you cannot fail to be impressed by the level of independent critical thinking. And that, I think, should be the bigger lesson that George Orwell offers us in a way. I don't think we need the novels to be afraid of what's happening on the ground, which we see in front of our eyes. In fact, one of George Orwell's great collections is called In Front of Your Nose. And he argues that it can be very hard to step outside and see what has become practically transparent to us, which is oftentimes, how we make arguments that completely contradict facts on the ground, but we fall into patterns of thinking that serve, some popular cause, and then fail to actually take into account the evidence of where, our thinking may be going wrong. So I would say I definitely would call upon George Orwell at a time like this, but primarily to deepen our skills of critical thinking and to see through demagogue group.
So that's so interesting. So that brings me back to something that I wanted to ask you about at the beginning. You started off by talking about how polarized public opinion is, which again reminds me also of America, which brings us back to, Trump's recent win and what you just were talking about now about this sort of like loss of critical thinking and where people are voting against their basic interest. It sounds so strange to me sometimes when you hear people talking about, their economic troubles and they're feeling that the system is rigged and income inequality, and then they vote for this mega billionaire con artist as if he's going to like rescue them. It's so counterintuitive to me, and not just to me, to like a lot of people, and sort of just understanding this. And also understanding, getting back to what you were saying before about how nothing seemed to have moved that group, people with the pro-Trump opinions. And I'm wondering what your lessons are from that and whether or not any of the lessons you have about, the limits of shifting public opinion, even in the face of all kinds of things, so here, what lessons we have from the American election and how you see them applying to Israeli social political trends. That may be too many questions in one, but
I just think that I think that there is a great value in comparisons, but I don't think all the lessons are the same. In other words, I think America was talking about, was facing some similar trends, and certainly what I guess what I would say is the deeper causes of these things are different. The manifestation is very similar. The toolbox is very similar. The style, the rhetoric, the attempt to attack the judiciary, the manipulation, those things can be easily compared. And that's where I say they learn from and inspire one another. But I think that we have to understand that there's, each, as the cliche goes, each unhappy country is unhappy in its own way. And the deep causes of these things go back to some of the founding moments of each country and the founding myths of each country and the specific type of existential threat or perceived existential threat, both can be true, that people experience. And so I think in America, it goes back to a very different sense of what it means to be run by the federal government or what it means to be completely independent in different states. And of course, it goes back to pre-Civil War era and people's attitudes towards slavery. And I think that's in there somewhere.
Yes.
It really symbolizes how people feel about what freedom means. I mean, freedom means something completely different, let's just say, to Republicans and Democrats today, I think it might be too much, I would need more hours to go into my theory of how this relates back to, slavery or constitutional amendments, for example. Let's talk about constitutional amendments. For many Americans, the Second Amendment is a matter of an existential question of what freedom means. And I think that, in Israel, people aren't exactly defined by their freedom of whether they can own a gun or not. It's a very different question. It happens to be an important policy question right now, but it's not even, it doesn't even remotely touch in the same place. What Israelis do experience.
Even talking about that, just as an example of sort of people being so entrenched in their views that make no sense. So let's say Second Amendment is, an expression of freedom. You're still seeing thousands of preventable deaths based on this like crazy, uncontrolled, untamed lust for ammunition, unnecessary, semi-automatic weapons. I mean, it's so hard as an observer, a little bit of the distance here, right? I mean, I'm originally American and all that, so that's why I'm invested there, but I'm still far away and I'm watching this and I'm thinking, even if you think that guns should be an expression of freedom, how is it that people are watching these gun deaths, these mass shootings, and not asking themselves, maybe I should change my views on this? How come that doesn't happen? I mean, that's the big question. That's my big question for the Trump era. And it's also my big question in Israel. How is it, getting back to Israel also, how is it that we're looking at this and you're looking at these hostages dying and you're looking at all the things, the 45,000 people killed in Gaza. We're looking at all, and we're watching this government that is acting in such corruption with such, expressed intent to destroy democracy. People are watching this. And yet, I'm not sure. Like, I'm trying to. Are people watching this and saying, maybe I should change my opinions about Netanyahu, or maybe I should change my opinions about Likud, or maybe I'm wrong about something like that? Is that happening? Does that happen? Do people change their views?
Of course, people change their views, and now we have a number of questions out there. So I'm going to, with your permission, I'll probably skip over to some extent the American political analysis. But to say, there is a majority of Americans in every single survey who support some gun regulations. And the fact that the government doesn't do it is a tribute to some of the disconnect between government and people in the direction that you're saying. Right, that the government should have been to place more restrictions on guns in America. Now, in Israel, when you're asking about do people change on these issues, when it comes to their attitudes towards government, they absolutely do change their mind. For one thing, we saw that in 4 election cycles until the 5th, when Netanyahu won his majority, he was actually able to win a majority. That's because people were changing their mind about him. I mean, he and his coalition.
Small amount. It was like this tiny sliver of people.
But that's normal. People. Yes, but only small numbers of people change their minds usually. Many people in most societies are pretty much set in their general patterns. A few percentage points, just like in the US, we're talking about a few percentage points, change their minds. So in Israel, we had people who changed their minds in the first few elections and did not support Netanyahu's coalition partners. Then we had people who, where a majority voted for opposition parties and the opposition formed a government. And then people swung back a little bit sufficiently to put Netanyahu back in with a significant majority without getting into all the coalition building reasons for that. But I will say this, Netanyahu's coalition partners in 2022 did not actually win an absolute majority. They didn't win over 50% of all the votes cast. We had a lot of wasted votes. due to the electoral minimum threshold of 3.25%. And what we saw is that just under 50% actually voted for Netanyahu and his coalition parties, but nevertheless, the calculation did lead them to 64 out of 120 seats, and that's a majority. What we saw when you ask about whether people change their mind in light of developments in evidence is absolutely yes. The moment the judicial reform was announced in January 2023, the government lost its majority. When I say majority, I mean in coalition seats, which is how we tend to present survey results.
Yeah, just so I understand this. So you're saying the same thing you said at the beginning about the war, which is that the government lost its, the government is at odds. The government actions are actually at odds with where majority public opinion stands. Is that right?
I would say that the polling with relation to the government's success in elections is reflective of the disconnect particularly on the policy of the hostages. But what I was talking about just now was 2023, even before, right? Just after the government was elected, polls were already showing that it had lost its majority and it never gained it back in any of the credible polls. I'm not talking about one polling company, which is very close with the prime minister, but in all polls in 2023, the government was only able to get 50 something seats, usually 52, 54 out of 120. And then when the war came, after October 7th, for months, the government coalition parties, the original coalition parties, weren't even able to get beyond 42 to 46 seats out of 120. So they had lost a significant amount of their votes. Likud's numbers, Likud has 32 seats in the current Knesset, had gone down to as low as 16 seats, so losing half of its strength. And for a long time was stuck around 17 or 18 seats. So people definitely changed their mind. What
That's really important.
However,
this is like really, I think it's really significant what you're pointing out here, because even, I think that there are sometimes perceptions. I guess these perceptions, these wrong perceptions, that it's like, especially in everyday life, also this sense that like people really are so stuck and not, in these opinions and not necessarily looking, at what is actually happening. And what you're saying is the opposite, that even though sometimes it feels entrenched and it feels stuck, in fact, there is a lot of movement. And that even if
I agree with you, that's what I see in the data. But I also see in the data that the public has in some ways shifted back to show somewhat more support for the government, not where it was when it won the elections. It still cannot win a majority in surveys if elections were held today. Starting around 6 months after the beginning of the war, the government recovered from that really, really low point. And when I say the government, I mean surveys testing Netanyahu's personal popularity, the Likud, the coalition parties, and general trust in government, all still low, but better than it was at the lowest point, which lasted. That lowest point was actually a phase of roughly 6 months. And where it is now is closer to where we saw those ratings on those different measures throughout 2023, which was still a majority against Netanyahu. And, there's still surveys showing that 70% would prefer that he resign either immediately or after the war. But I have to put a footnote on that too. After the war is a pretty non-committal thing because nobody knows when the war is going to end and what will count as an end of the war. Still, it is still the case that a majority of the Israelis are not supportive of the coalition parties, of Mr. Netanyahu, or of his continuing in power, or of his policies with relation to continuing the war without bringing the hostages home. And that is an indictment of the government. And I think it's fair to say that the government doesn't represent public opinion. Having said that, it's also important to say that in the Israeli political system, public opinion does not drive governance. Elections drive who is in power. And there is no mechanism for turning polling or demonstrations, no matter how unprecedented they are in their endurance over time and their strength of numbers, for turning that into toppling the government and going into elections. It's not the way the system works. If it happened, it would be something like a coup, the kind of thing that we've seen during the Arab Spring or most recently in Syria, or there is a precedent for it in Israel after the Yom Kippur War when there were massive demonstrations against the prime minister. There was a prime minister who felt the responsibility on his shoulders of having lost public legitimacy and resigned. But Netanyahu is made of, he has a different character. He doesn't feel that level of responsibility or accountability to the public, no matter how many people are on the street, at least not so far.
Yeah, I just want to say I feel very validated that you said that about how that there's really no mechanism for protests and polling and public opinion to topple the government. As an American, where we're used to growing up with the idea that, we can protest, we can call our local representative, you have an impact because you know that your local representative relies on you for his, getting reelected. There's a certain frustration, like a real deep, I feel like a real, like disarming. I feel like, you go out and for a year, 11 months, we were protesting, 500,000 people would protest every Saturday night or more. And it didn't matter. The government doesn't answer to us. And so that feels very hard. It's very, in the long term, to be dealing with that feels hard. And I just want to say that I'm really grateful to you for validating that feeling because, um, I guess it's true that the system is built that way. Is that right? The system is, it's
I think
different.
that I think that most systems, most political and electoral systems that are set up in order to be with the aspiration or the kind of let's say the I don't know, ersatz might be too cynical, but the with the attempting to be a democratic, at least electoral system, because I think there's so many missing pieces of democracy in Israel that it's hard to talk about it as a democratic society. But the electoral institution is democratic for those who are able to participate in it, and it was intended to reflect the democratic system. And it shouldn't be subject to to the whims of public opinion. The fact that Israeli governments rarely last a full term, and the average is somewhere between 2.3 and 2.6 years, is not to the credit of the Israeli government. Because we often think about the American system as very stable, right? Elections every 4 years for a president, and we elections are scheduled, and we know when they are, and there's nothing like this instability and this roller coaster of government collapse. The fact is that America does schedule elections every 2 years. You raise an important point, and every 2 years, people are subject. The lawmakers are subject to the voters' judgment. And as you say, they know that the elections are always coming up, and the voters will have their say, and they could send them home. And I think that in Israel, if the government doesn't fall in advance, there really could be a full 4 years in which there is no accountability. And in fact, it's just not another one of the many ways in which Israel is an anomaly for not having the same level of checks and balance. And if you just look through a long list of mechanisms that democratic societies have, constitutional systems have used to structure checks and balances and make sure that power is dispersed throughout the different branches of government so that no one can create a tyrannical dictatorship.
And also, there's the issue I want to also ask you about, which is separation of church and state, separation of religion and state, among other things. Wait, so just to recap for a second about the ways that Israel lacks checks and balances. There's only one house of parliament instead of two. There's no independent judiciary.
No, there is an independent judiciary. I would have to say that's the one thing that Israel really does have.
It does have, but it's under threat now.
It's under significant threat now.
Right. Okay.
But I mean, remember that for the most part, I think that it's still important to say that with all of the complications for trying to describe or label Israel's system, the judiciary is still independent. It's under severe strain. It's taken a significant hit to its legitimacy over time. Public opinion used to be consensus trust in the Supreme Court. It's gone down to about 40%, which is still far higher than the level of trust in institutions that are political by nature, particularly the Knesset, political parties, the government. All of those enjoy 140%, 25% trust or less. Okay, so it's important to keep that in mind. But still, the Supreme Court used to enjoy something like 70, 75% support trust. And now it's way down because of these politicized attacks. At least that's my interpretation, because you see the difference between right, center, and left wing, right? The center and the left still deeply trust the Supreme Court, whereas it's the right wing who's most attentive to the kinds of arguments being made by right wing leaders who are saying the court is bad and doesn't represent you and is undermining your Jewish identity and all sorts of things and putting your security at risk and going against the government. And so it's their supporters who are hearing those messages and who are increasingly against the Supreme Court, which is kind of a stand-in for how they feel about the judiciary. And I think that makes a very strong evidence-based case for the fact that this is a politicized attack, not a reflection on how the court actually has behaved or wrong. Although one could certainly debate at a professional level whether the court has been too activist in intervening in state policy and legislation. And I think that may be the case, but I would argue that the court has been forced into that situation by the fact that Israel doesn't have the normal level of checks and balances. And you started to name what they are, right? There's only one chamber of parliament. We only have a ceremonial president. The president does not have a veto. Israel doesn't even have a formal written constitution. It's not part of international bodies that would regulate certain kinds of basic human rights legislation, like such as the European Union. And, these are the kinds of things. There are no number of others. We don't have any regional representation. So, the Knesset doesn't have any specific accountability to separate constituencies. We're a single proportional representation system. And all of these things lead to an executive power that is structurally stronger than pretty much anything you would see in other democratic systems. And analysts and our great colleagues over at the Israeli Democracy Institute have put together very nice tables trying to just putting a check mark next to every country and its different institutional checks and balances. And Israel has fewer than any of the other Western democratic countries. Add to that, it's a country that's always been engaged in a military conflict, especially if you include the occupation as a military conflict, which it is. The military occupation. And for those reasons, you're really missing very fundamental institutional pillars of democracy, and the practice has been essentially damaged. If it ever was, there was never something like a complete level of democratic practice, considering Israel's always enacted some sort of military law over subjects, whether it's through the occupation or through the military regime that governed its own citizens in the first 20 years. So we have a significant problem, and we need, a very sort of emergency level of, reconstituting democracy in Israel if there ever is to be some fulfillment of that promise that I argue has not yet been fulfilled.
Yeah. And what you were saying about, we're also engaged in all this, the occupation and now this war, and you have the Hague telling Israel that its prime minister is wanted for war crimes, and yet we have no mechanisms. We have no internal mechanisms to deal with that, to handle that. Yes, is that right?
Yeah, that's also a very significant. We have the mechanisms. We have the legislation in place to create a commission, a state commission of inquiry. The government has been trying everything it can to avoid establishing a state commission of inquiry, even though the vast majority of the Israeli public is supportive of a state commission of inquiry. I just conducted a poll myself that was commissioned by Zulat, the Institute for Liberal Values, run by Zahava Galon, and we found, we asked people if they would prefer a state, commission of inquiry in which Supreme Court justices are the ones who lead that kind of commission, or and appoint the members of the committee, or whether it would prefer to have what the government wants, which is a government commission of inquiry. So it's essentially appointed by the government, or else a completely different form of law, completely different law that the government is now trying to pass that would actually prohibit the establishment of a state commission of inquiry, and appoint a kind of commission of inquiry that is chosen by members of the coalition and the opposition, but which is still political. And the public overwhelmingly favors the state commission of inquiry, in which Supreme Court justices will be deciding the members of that commission. It's another way in which the government is completely going against the will of the people. So that mechanism does exist, but Israel won't do it. And I would go one step further, since you mentioned the international courts. For anybody who doesn't know, the international courts, whether it's the International Criminal Court, which tries individuals, or the International Court of Justice, which settles disputes between states, Israel is facing charges at both of those courts. In the International Court of Justice, it's being accused by South Africa of committing genocide. In the International Criminal Court, the Prime Minister and the former Defense Minister, Yoav Gallant, are wanted for very severe war crimes, even though it doesn't include the crime of genocide. And those courts work on the principle of complementarity, which simply means that if those courts, or if Israel can convincingly argue that it's going to prosecute those claims on its own, the courts would have a reason to say, well, we're not going to prosecute these claims. But not only is Israel not doing that now, Israel doesn't have a strong track record of prosecuting its own potential or allegations of war crimes in the past. And all of the discussion around the state commission of inquiry or government commission of inquiry or any commission of inquiry, including the citizen commission of inquiry that was established by private individuals who were frustrated, who were families of victims of October 7th, et cetera. All of those discussions are about examining who was responsible for the failures of October 7th, who failed to detect it, who failed to prevent it, maybe how, the failures of the state's response in terms of supporting the victims or the people who were displaced, or how they managed the war, not getting the hostages back. I can't tell you of a single kind of public figure, certainly not a politician in this country, other than from the very far left or from the Palestinian citizens of Israel, who've advocated in any way for a state commission of inquiry to look into Israel's conduct in the war, the destruction in Gaza, the killing of civilians, possible targeting of civilians, destruction of civilian infrastructure. You know, I mean, I don't need to go through the whole chronicle, but it's extremely,
Yeah, which I feel like also,
sobering. And that is not part of the conversation about what Israel plans to investigate in any scenario of an investigative commission.
I just had this conversation with someone today, a friend of mine who was saying to me, oh, there are lots of people who are expressing disillusionment with the war because, they feel like the extended war is not good for Israeli morale. So I said, well, that discussion is important, but there's nothing in that discussion which relates to what the people in Gaza are experiencing. You're saying, oh, the war is not good for us. But how is this war for the people in Gaza and the 45,000 people who were killed and the 2 million displaced?
I mean, I can only add my voice to what I would imagine is any human and humane response to the destruction in Gaza, which is that it has violated every moral code. It has destroyed civilians. It has targeted civilians. I mean, again, these are allegations, but we have so much evidence that's been compiled at this point, least of which is my own observation. I mean, there is more information out there than I think we've seen at most times in history. At a click of a button, anybody can see, the number of children who've been mutilated by bombardments and the number of shelter areas, Mawasi and other shelter areas that have been targeted by bombardments and civilian infrastructure, water infrastructure is actually a little bit different, but so many forms of civilian infrastructure that have been destroyed, schools, universities, libraries, residential buildings. I mean, the chronicle goes on. Gaza is essentially uninhabitable, and it won't be inhabitable for years to come. We have no idea who's going to even start reconstructing it. The dislocation of I think we're up to probably 95 or 97% of Gaza's population has been displaced. Yeah. Those are mostly, if not largely, mostly civilians. And so, how do I feel about it? I think that as an Israeli, the country has really violated my own personal sense of human sensibility, moral code, and probably also war crimes.
Yeah. And
the war needs to stop because there's no way to stop this. There's no way to get to a long-term resolution. There's no way to begin reconstructing Gaza until there is an end to the war. I don't think it's wrong to say it's better for both sides.
Yeah. I had a conversation with some people about, we were talking about environmental issues and some of the climate crises that were emerging from this war. And we were talking about the garbage pileup, right? There was an article in the New York Times about a month ago about the rubble, about how if you would pile up just the rubble in Gaza, it would be something like, 20 meters high, the size of Central Park, and it would take 8 years to remove. And these two women, we were talking about this, and one said, "What do you mean remove? We can't even remove it because the rubble piles are A, full of explosives, and B, full of bodies." So, yes. It's all of these issues are, you're talking about not all of these disasters. I mean, these are disasters on multiple levels. And yet getting back to your comments about Israeli democracy and the mechanisms within the Israeli system to A, correct itself, or B, respond to external demands for correction. I mean, those seem to not really exist. Am I understanding that right?
They exist, but it's a choice, is what I'm trying to say. You have the mechanisms out there.
They don't exist as something that has to get done. It's sort of like optional. It's sort of like, it's voluntary.
Yes, Israel is not required to do these things.
So that's really, right. I have to say, disturbing. Even though I live it, I feel like what you described describes my feeling, as being part of these protest movements, as being part of the hundreds of thousands, if not millions of Israelis who have been screaming for 2 years now and feeling like, what's changing, what's happening, like nothing, feeling like the government can be out of step with public opinion and there's no way to change that. I mean, I know, I'm sorry if I keep saying the same thing too, and I'm sorry, I don't mean to like.
No, I think that it's worth reminding, listeners that theoretically, Israel's electoral system is structured in a way that there are supposed to be elections every 4 years. And if the Israeli people want to, they can choose a different government in 2026 when elections are formally scheduled if the government doesn't fall before that. But we also, I mean, I think one of the scariest things that we've seen about the democratic erosion in other countries, the rise of illiberalism, is that sometimes people making that choice. And I think that people right now are in a deeply traumatized and vulnerable situation, devastated. Everybody's lost somebody or is about to lose somebody or fears losing somebody. Tens of thousands of Israelis have been displaced. Tens of thousands of Israelis have taken an severe economic blow. Their businesses have closed, or they're not as profitable, or their industry has collapsed, or I have a family member who's been in reserve duty all year and can't actually get the same level of income. So people are in a very vulnerable situation. So I think that we don't know who people will vote for, but first and foremost, sometimes you can't expect the public to be the one, with a great vision of what to do to change things. You need courage from opposition politicians, and that's something we also, unfortunately, really aren't seeing, with a couple of very small exceptions, very minimal exceptions. The Israeli opposition leadership is not really offering an alternative vision, certainly not in any big and comprehensive way. It's true that Yair Lapid, who leads a medium-sized centrist party, but is still technically the head of the opposition, right? Because his party came in second place in 2022. He did actually recently put out a plan that was surprisingly detailed in terms of a comprehensive approach towards ending this war and moving ahead towards a bigger Middle Eastern supported process. But it's got very little attention, and if it hasn't gotten that much attention, I sense that he maybe hasn't been promoting it full-throatedly. But nevertheless, it's a start. He's also the last Israeli prime minister to openly say the words two-state solution. But I think the opposition in general needs to be much more thoughtful, visionary, and courageous in making the case to the Israeli public so that people know that there is some other path and they can debate whether they agree or disagree with it. But right now, the field is completely left abandoned to these very powerful messages coming from the elected leadership. And so Israel is steeped in the idea that there can never be peace, that there can never be long-term conflict resolution, that Israel gave back territory in the past, which is, factually not true. That Israel left Gaza, also factually not true. If anything, Israel dismantled settlements, but it never relinquished its control over Gaza. And all of these things, led to Palestinian violence against Israel. That is the main and overwhelming theme of the Israeli government, and very few opposition politicians are willing to simply do what a politician needs to do to be worth his or her name, and that's lead, present an alternative analysis, present an alternative vision, correct what's wrong other than just talking about how bad Netanyahu is, which is what they tend to do. And I think that they will find that there is more openness to that kind of really presenting a bigger alternative vision than they think.
Interesting. That's interesting. That's really interesting. So you think that Israelis are willing to hear a different vision? Okay, that's hopeful. That's optimistic.
So,
we have.
Right? I don't want to overstate the case.
That's okay. We like to end our podcast actually with a moment of hope. So, or like something, because we can be very overwhelmingly dark what we're talking about. Anyway, we do have to come to a close. I cannot believe our hour is up. I still have so many questions to ask you. I really wanted to ask you a little bit more about the religious right and a little bit more about public opinion, especially vis-a-vis radical right religious opinions, but we'll have to save that for the next time. I also really wanted to talk to you about Palestinian public opinion, but I think that deserves its own hour. So maybe we can stay in touch and maybe have you get on in season 3 to have maybe follow up, because wow, you're so full of really, really important insights, vital insights. Like these are the things, and also your last insight, the last thing you said about the need for an alternative vision and Israelis' willingness. An optimistic view, Israelis' willingness to hear an optimistic vision if it be presented. I love that.
Maybe I can end with a point that sort of illustrates what I'm talking about. I don't want this to just be kind of this abstract, let me beg my politicians for an alternative vision. There are alternative visions out there. I myself am a board member of A Land for All, which proposes, for example, conflict resolution along the lines of two states, but which is based on partnership, which is based on freedom of movement, which is based on needs-based interaction built into the solution itself. Does not depend on putting up hermetic walls, which are inconvenient and will never happen and have become an excuse over time never to reach any solution. And so we have, a very, very committed group of people who are committed to these values and work together even throughout this war, Israelis and Palestinians who simply are realistic, pragmatic, and see our shared fate here as not just some sort of, fate that we have to live with, but actually as an opportunity for a positive outlook.
First of all, I love Land for All. We interviewed Dr. Rula Hardal in season 1. They're amazing.
Great.
And also, I recently watched your webinar. You did a webinar with Rula Hardal and Mai Pundak, the co-executive directors of Land for All. I'm going to put the link into the description of this podcast because it's, wow, so worth watching. Really, there were a couple of takeaways from that webinar that have really stayed with me. So that was great. Thank you so much for reminding me of that. Thank you so much. This was, wow, so important. All of this is so important. And there's so much more to say, really. So hopefully we'll chat again.
Thank you so much for having me and for giving me the opportunity, even if my answers sometimes go on a little bit longer than we all hope. But I hope we'll get to the other questions at another time. Thank you.
Full. Your answers are so full. Every sentence is so important. Thank you.
Great. Thank you.
You've been listening to the podcast Women Ending War. I'm Dr. Ilana Stockman, and my co-host is Eva Dalak. If you like this, please subscribe, share, like, and comment. Links to our channels on YouTube, Spotify, and Apple are below. Follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and Substack. And please consider supporting us financially. We need your help. Link to our GoFundMe page is below. In peace, salam, and shalom.